Good morning, students. I am architect Amit Inam, assistant professor at School of Architecture, Algotia University. We will be discussing today the principles of design and its role in expression. While we are discussing all these, we need to understand that there are different principles of design that are used while designing a kind of composition. So this lecture is focused on proportion, which is a principle of design. So before starting, it is very important for a student to understand it's recapitulating the different information about the previous knowledge. Student should have the basic understanding, the basic definition of the design. He should be very well aware of the knowledge of different principles of design, and he should have a knowledge about how to relate the different elements of design together. Objectives of this lecture are very clear. Student will be able to understand the definition of proportion. He will be understanding the impact of proportion in design, understanding of different types of proportion in design, and in the last, a comparison of ratio and proportion. So let us first understand the basic definition of proportion. Proportion refers to the proper or harmonious relation of one part to another or to the whole. This means if there are two or more types of elements of design in a proper composition, there is always a need of the contextual study. This is as same as the number of spoons of sugar are required in a proper proportion to make a perfect cup of tea. Proportion also refers to the relative size and scale of various elements in a design. It is the relationship between objects or parts of the whole. This means that it is very important and very necessary to discuss proportion in terms of context or the different standard used to determine proportion. For example, if we compare the different window heights, the door heights, or the furniture sizes, we always compare it with the standard height of the wall. If you look at the figure on your right, and we are talking about proportion of three different sizes of circle, the green circle is the smallest one, the yellow one is in the middle, and the blue circle is the largest one. So when we compare the three circles together, we say that the green circle is the smallest one when we talk about in the contextual study of the bigger circle, which is the blue color. When we use the term proportion in art, the proportion in art is the comparative harmonious relationship between two or more elements in a composition with respect to their sizes, color, quantity, degree, or ratio. It is a relationship which is created when two or more elements are put together in a composition. This relationship is said to be harmonious when a correct and desirable relationship exists between the two elements. This refers to the correct sizing and distribution of an element or object which creates good proportion. A good proportion always adds harmony and symmetry or balance among the parts of a design or as a whole. The proportioning systems that are used in architectural design refer to the systems that go beyond to the functional and technical determinants of the architectural form and different spaces to provide an aesthetical rationale for their dimensions. They can visually unify the different multiplicity of elements together in an architectural design by having all of its parts belong to the same family of proportion. Proportion and scale are used extensively in architecture to create the form of that are both pleasing to eye and establishing a balance between the two. Designers often use scale and proportion to create compositions that are appropriate for the site and intended to use of the proportion. Once the proportioning system is established in an architectural design, they can provide a sense of order, highlighting the different continuity and different sequence of spaces. We can also establish the relationship between the different spaces of the building, for example, the interior of the building and to the exterior element of the building. We have different theories of proportion, for example, the golden section theory, the classical order theory, and the Renaissance theory. Classical order theory, which was used by the people of Greek and Roman, so they determine the different proportions of the elements of design while comparing it with the contextual study of the diameter of their column. In Renaissance theory, they are more focused towards the mathematical theory of Pythagoras theorem and different other theory of mathematics. When the principle of proportion is applied to a composition of two or more elements of a design, it is usually done to determine the relationship of their sizes. As you can see in a figure, proportion is developed when we talk about scale, when we talk about the proportion of the head while comparing it with the different features of the face and in exaggeration. That is the size of one element of the composition as compared to the size of the another related element. In instant of a relationship of a size of a comparison is made between the height, width and depth of one element to that of the other element of the design. Size of one area to the size of the another area. For example, if we compare the size of a bedroom to the size of the attached toilet, size of one element to the size of the other element. For example, if we again compare the size of a window to the height of the wall, amount of space between the two or more elements. There are different types of proportion that can be seen in architectural design. We have an examples of bad proportion as well as we have examples of good proportion. In a bad proportion, examples on the right of the illustration above the top row, which use the equal division of shapes, creates monotony, and in the bottom row, the very unequal division creates a lack of harmony. So these two divisions are examples of bad proportion. There are times when proportion can be used to convey a message. For example, it is impossible to hold a world in your hand, yet composition does exactly that. It is a type of bad proportion, but it is used to convey a message. And again, for example, whiteout can be used to cover all sort of things, but it is unlikely you would paint crosswalks with it. So these are the examples of bad proportion. These pictures depict the uncertainty of the proportion in an image. For example, the uncertainty of sizes of different furniture layout in contextual study of their different other sizes of the furniture or the wall height or the different elements or the floor spaces and the usage of the different spaces. So it is very important to understand that once we are comparing or creating a composition of different elements together, it is important to understand the correct proportion of the different elements together. When we talk about the types of proportions, we also have a good proportion in architectural design. There are several ways for achieving good proportion. Place together different elements which are similar in character or have some features in common. Create major and minor areas in the design, since equal parts can quickly become monotonous or boring. Arrangement of such spaces should be in such a way that the eye does not perceive standard mathematical relationship. Dividing up the composition in half, quarters, or one-thirds should be avoided. As you can see on the right hand side of the image, a good proportion does not have the division of shapes into halves, quarters, or thirds. Create harmony in a type of composition gives a perception of a good proportion. In this image, you can see a composition of 4 images achieving a good proportion. In a good proportion, there are different elements that are put together in a proper size and shape, while in context of the different other elements too. In the previous slide, when we are discussing about the bad proportion, the different types of furniture layout were not in a proportion of the contextual study, or the wall size, or the window height. So it is very important to understand that while designing a area or a space, if there is a need to understand the sizes of different elements or features. So now let us understand the difference between ratio and proportion. We often get confused between the two while designing or while we are creating a composition of different elements together. It is very important to understand that ratio is referred to the quantitative comparison of two similar things, while proportion refers to the equality of different ratios. A ratio can be represented as in a form of, for example, 10 is to 5, 10 by 5, or 10 to 5. While in proportion, it can be represented as in the form of 10 by 5, which can be represented as 2 by 1. So now, while we are discussing these representative form of ratio and proportion, when we talk about ratio and we are talking about 10 is to 5, this means that we are talking about two similar kind of things that are in a ratio of one thing is in a form of composition of a value of 10 units, and the other one is which is also a similar kind of thing and is in a composition of 5 units. While in proportion, when we talk about 10 by 5 or 2 by 1, this means we are talking about something that is in a form of a composition, and the composition has different elements, and one element has a value of 2 units, and another element has a value of 1 unit. But in proportion, these all together are compared in a form of a whole. So again, when we talk about the examples of ratio, we have aspect ratio or ratio in size of a door or window. There are two types of doors. One is in the form of, let's say, a width of 3 meters. Another one is a ratio. Another one is in a width of, let's say, 1.5 meters. So these two has a ratio of 2 is to 1 in the context of width. While when we talk about proportion, let we talk about the proportion between hands to the whole body. So it is important to understand that the proportion between the hands and the whole body is important because the whole body is the contextual study and hands are playing the role of the elements. Another example of proportion is the golden proportion or the golden ratio. While we talk about in ratio, we have the different examples of aspect ratio. So let us conclude the lecture with the following points. Proportion is the principle of art that refers to relative sizes of different elements in a composition. The principle of art differs from the elements of art. Most, if not all, of the principle of art deal with how the elements of art are arranged in a work of art. Proportion is largely about the relationship of the sizes of one element when compared to the other element, or when we compare the composition as a whole to the contextual study. When working with proportion, you will also want to consider how the different elements are working together to form a composition, and similarly, while being in a proportion to each other in a design. It should not be confused with scale, which defines the relation between different artwork and their sizes. So as there is a difference between ratio and proportion, there is also a difference between scale and proportion. The scale can be defined as the different sizes of similar kind of elements together in a composition to form a better form of design. So continuing with the conclusion, it is important to understand that the effective use of proportion in design is often referred to the harmony, which is the relationship in which the various elements of the composition of different elements appear as if they belong together in size and distribution, as if they belong to the same family but have different proportion together. Proportion is one of the principles of art and design that organizes and arranges their structural element together with balance, unity, rhythm, and emphasis. There is no right or wrong when it comes to the application of proportion, as it can alter the way our spaces look and feel. Getting proportion right all depends on the intent of the designer. So it is important and necessary to understand the different types of proportion, the different elements of proportion, and the different types of arrangement of composition in context to proportion while designing a composition or a design, so that the perception of the image or the perception of the design looks better. So while you note down these references for your further study or gaining some more information related to this presentation about the topic of role of principle of design in context of proportion, while we are creating a different kind of composition of different elements of design together, keeping in mind the context of proportion. These references will definitely help you. Apart from these references, I have three assignmental questions for you so that I can uh, give marks. My first question is related to a comparative study of scale and proportion. So my question is, what do you think is the difference between a scale and proportion? As we have discussed that there is a difference between ratio and proportion, similarly there is a difference between a scale and proportion. So you can note down 3 to 4 points giving the difference between these two, quoting them how a scale is represented and how a proportion is represented, giving some examples from internet. My second question is about the role and importance of proportion in designing or while we are creating a composition of different elements of design. My third and last question is about the understanding the concluding slide. You have to note down some points you have understood through this from this presentation about the importance of proportion and the importance of ratio together, so that this whole idea of making you understand the role of proportion, which is the principle of another principle of design, while we are creating a composition. Thank you very much. And in the next lecture, we will be discussing about another element of design. Like we have discussed proportion today, we will be discussing another element of design in context to how that element can play a role while determining the different elements of composition or while we are designing. Thank you.